صباح الخير لكل مشاهدين الام تي في. ما اجمل لقاء الكتاب ولقاء الثقافات، وما اجمل بيروت لمن بتكون هي عم بتحافظ على وجه لبنان الحضاري اللي عم نفتقد له لسوء الحظ هالايام، وين المشاكل الامنيه والاقتصاديه هي اللي عم تحتل الساحه. ولكن يعني بنتشكر الهي فيستيفال اللي اختارت بيروت لتحتفل بعيدها ال25، واكثر من 50 كاتب وصحافي ومدون ومصور من حول العالم كانوا ببيروت، واليوم كمان بعدهم بشرفني اني استضيف كاتبين عالميين اليوم بفقره كتاب. بحب رحب باستديوهات MTV كمان بالكاتب جون لي أندرسون. You're the most welcome.
Thank you very much.
This is your first visit to Lebanon?
No, I've been here a couple of times before. Briefly.
Briefly, and
yeah.
And this time also briefly. I know you're going after to Byblos to have some sightseeing.
Yeah. It was the first time I've had a chance to do any sightseeing in Lebanon, because the last time was for a funeral and the time before during the 2006 war. So I have not seen your country at its best. So this is a pleasure.
Yeah, it's a pleasure for us, and I hope you will enjoy your stay in Lebanon. وبحب رحب كمان مجددا لأنه نهار الخميس ما قدرنا نحصل على مقابلة معه، ولكن رجع معنا اليوم الكاتب Eugene Shoulgin. You're the most welcome.
Thank you very much.
And we are sorry for the Thursday, but I'm happy you're still in Lebanon so we can have a nice interview, interesting one.
It was a very good excuse to stay here, you know.
This is nice to hear, and I know it's not your first visit, and I hope it won't be the last.
I'm sure it will not.
رح أكيد أعرف على الكتاب العالميين. جون لي أندرسون من مواليد كاليفورنيا سنة 1957، وهو أيضا أمضى الكثير من طفولته وسنينه المراهقة ما بين كوريا الجنوبية وإندونيسيا وليبيريا وتايوان وكولومبيا وإنجلترا، وين هو اليوم مقيم، وهو صحافي متخصص بقضايا أمريكا الجنوبية، وحاليا بما يتعلق بالولايات المتحدة من بعد أكيد 11 أيلول 2001. وبدأ مسيرته المهنية كصحافي بالبيرو سنة 1979 لصحيفة The Lima Times، وبعدها أصبح كاتب وانشهر بكتاباته عن السيرة الذاتية لعدد من الشخصيات أمريكا الجنوبية، منها فيدل كاسترو وتشي جيفارا وجابرييل غارسيا ماركيز، وحاز على جائزة ريبورترز ديل موندو سنة 2005، وأيضا لعمله The Fall of Baghdad. وهو اليوم بيكتب مقالات لعدد كبير من الصحف والمجلات العالمية، وهو أيضا صحفي بصحيفة The New Yorker. ويوجين شولغن كاتب نرويجي من مواليد أوسلو سنة 1941، مقيم في تركيا، وهو ابن الرسام الشهير ألكسندر شولز، وعمل بعدد كبير بمؤسسة عالمية اللي هي بان، اللي بتعمل إلى إطلاق سراح الكتاب من السجون من حول العالم، وترأس هذه المؤسسة ما بين 2002 و2004، وأيضا سافر إلى عدد كبير من البلدان كرئيس أيضا للرايترز إن بريزن كوميتي اللي هو أسسها، وأصدر عدد كبير من الكتب اللي ترجمت إلى عدد كبير من اللغات، منها التركي الألماني والروسي وغيرها أيضا. Mr. Anderson, I know that you have written a lot of books about South American leaders like Fidel Castro, Che Guevara and others. Why this interest in political leaders like these great men? And another question also, who what are the similarities among them, and whose character interested you most?
Well, I'm American, as you know, and but I grew up at a time of great convulsion in the world. I grew up at the time of the Vietnam War. I'm young. I was too young to be in the Vietnam War, but I grew up at a time in which established authority, was being questioned by the youth around the world, because the adults seemed to have failed. There was a time in which everything was being questioned. In a way, what's happening today in the Arab world is somehow resonant of that time. And I grew up with a strong feeling of interest in the political outlaw, those who questioned established authority, which, as I say, seemed to have failed the world repeatedly. In World War II, in the 60s, a series of wars, civil rights in the United States, and so on. I found this figure of the political outlaw especially fascinating. You had, in a way, the first rebel state in the post-war years of the Cold War in Cuba. And Fidel Castro, of course, he's still alive. He's been there ever since. It's been 50 years. He created somehow the model for the small state that asserted its independence. Some might agree, some might not agree, but nonetheless, he's there. Che Guevara helped him, and Che Guevara represented the figure of the internationalist, this idea of the man who would help liberate the world. It was quite an extraordinary vision he had, and so I wanted to explore his life and find out why he had decided to do what he did, because he was a well-born son of Argentina. He came from very kind of noble blood, you could say. He was trained as a doctor, and yet he became the most implacable revolutionary of his time. And so I began reporting in Latin America at a time when the United States was fighting the Russians via proxies in the guerrilla wars and counter-guerrilla wars of the 1980s. And out of this, I began to write about those people who went into the mountains with a gun for an idea and whose stories really weren't written. But I saw that around the world there were people like this, and that history was being changed by them. And so I wanted to find out what made them tick and what their stories were. And I discovered that new histories were being sort of created in these insurgencies around the world. And somehow new societies, somehow political outlaw societies were being created. And out of this came this interest in, then I wrote first about these guerrillas in different parts of the world, Muslim world, Latin world, all over Africa. And then I began to hone my interest in the individuals who seemed to exemplify that sort of individual. And these are people who, for better or worse, since time immemorial, have stepped outside of the mainstream and decided that they don't agree with it and that it's worth dying to change it. And that is what makes me always interested in them. I'm interested in that, so as a kind of paradigm of political change, and as a kind of constant in human history. I suppose I also want to unlock the key to violence at some level.
That's nice.
And I'm interested in the organization of violence by political groups. We always tend to launder our violence. After a few years it becomes somehow okay. And I'm also fascinated in that alchemy, that process, and the kind of mythologization that comes with politics.
Indeed.
And so there's no easy answer to your questions, but that in a sort of nutshell is kind of what's motivated me, I think.
Okay. And Eugene, I know that he's speaking about what these leaders had in mind and why they didn't want to do all these changes, and they believe in this change. They really believed in this, all these changes, and even in the name of sometimes of violence, they had to do a lot of things. you are also responsible in a way of these writers that are all around the world and who are in prisons, and you are there to try to help them in a way. Why, first of all, why these writers are in jail? For they believe also, because they have written about hot subjects?
Absolutely, yeah. You see, that is exactly what it's all about. It is resistance. It's different kind of resistance. Those writers I have been most occupied with are not connected to a political movement as such. That's not the reason why I'm interested in them. But the fact that they are risking their civil position, everything, to advocate their ideas. Many of them have to spend most of their lives in prison in different countries. Most of the time, even in extremely bad conditions. I mean, you can't imagine the conditions I've seen in different prisons around the world. And also, I'm curious to see what drives people to do this. What drives them to, you can say in a common way, destroy their lives, because that is what they're doing, you know. I have talked to people who have been for 20 years in prison, and ask them what is actually, what kind of life do you look forward to? I mean, most likely you will be staying here. We will try to help you out.
They don't want, they are pleased to be where they are?
No,
not
of course
at all.
not. But they say that as long as people like you bother, and as long as we are not forgotten, we have a feeling that our lives is not in vain. And that is exactly what we in PEN try to do. We try to highlight these people's business, and of course we try to help them out. And on top of that, we also try to help their families, because this is a part of the problem which is most of the time forgotten. That most of these writers, they have families, they have wives, they have children,
suffering,
and they're really suffering.
Of course.
So, but first of all, to highlight, because you know we have some few very famous writers who have been in prison, or are threatened by prison. And
the reason why they are in prison is because of their freedom of expression?
Exactly, exactly.
And not always related to politics?
Most of the time it's politics, most of the time it's politics, of course. And
sometimes it's social.
Yes, it
or
can
taboos,
be.
they go
yes,
into taboos.
Yes, that's true. That's true.
حديث رائع جميل. كنت عم بحكي مع مستر أندرسون وسألته ليه كتب السيرة الذاتية اللي فينا نقول ليدرز بأمريكا الجنوبية مثل فيدل كاسترو، تشي جيفارا وغيرهم. قال لأنه أولا حب يحكي عن تغييرات صارت، ناس حققوا امور كثيره مثل فيدل كاسترو له 50 سنه، هلا في ناس معه في ناس ضده، ولكن حقق تغييرات وغير التاريخ، وهذا الشيء كثير مهم. وعم بيقول اللي صار بامريكا الجنوبيه ممكن يكون صار بغير مناطق ايضا. وكمان حكي عن تشي جيفارا لانه ساعد ومشي على خطى فيدل كاسترو، وحكي عن الجيريلاز اللي طلعوا كمان على الجبال، وحب انه يضوي على هالامور ويعرف العنف اكثر شيء. ليه الناس بتغطي العنف في تغطيه سياسيه، ولكن هي بتكون اكيد عنف موجود فيهم بداخلهم كناس. وسالت مستر شولغن شو رايه بالموضوع، خاصه انه هو بيشتغل مؤسسة بن وكان ترأسها اللي هي بتساعد كل الكتاب المسجونين حول العالم. وعم بيقول أكيد بيكونوا مسجونين لأنه من وراء حرية يعني الكتابة والرأي، وخاصة كمان بتكون هالاشياء متعلقة بالسياسة، وأيضا كمان بكل شيء تابو مواضيع بتكون ساخنه. وعم بيقول قد ايه بيساعدهم وقد ايه بيلاقيهم يكون لهم 20 سنه مسجونين وما عم بيعملوا شيء تيقدروا يظهروا، ولكن اكيد ما بيكونوا مبسوطين، وبيساعد عيالهم. عم بيقول قد ايه بيساعد العيال اللي بتكون اكيد كمان عم تتألم مع عضو الموجود بالسجون ايضا. we not just also, Mr. Anderson, that you are your interest in the South American matters also exists in your also journalistic activities. It's not only in your books. Why do you find it so interesting also as on the news level? Because after I want to talk about your interest in the United States after 9/11.
It's not that I have a. I mean, I began as a reporter in Latin America.
In Peru, yeah.
In Peru and in El Salvador, in Nicaragua, and then I lived in Cuba, and I've traveled around. It's the Western Hemisphere. It's the part of the world that's most closely related to the United States, my country. It's had a very convulsive political history. I speak the language. And when I was becoming a reporter, the American president at the time declared the wars in that region the #1 national security agenda for the United States. Now, one would be amazed because there's almost a complete disinterest. I come from the point of view that it's as important to cover the places that are hot, so to speak, as it is the places that have been through experiences. If we turn our backs on the places where there have been wars, we will pay a price another generation later. And so a lot of my career has also been about going amongst places that have been battlefields, but are no longer fashionable. Because what happens there, as you might remember from Afghanistan, for 10 or 12 years this country was ignored by the outside world, and look what happened. And so on. And the same thing can happen anywhere. If in many ways the after war is more important than the war itself, because you have a generation of people who've been brutalized, who've been traumatized.
I can see now in Lebanon it's the
exactly.
same.
Yes. And you know, different countries have different abilities to address these issues.
Yeah, indeed.
So it's not only Latin America. I also go to the Middle East, Central Asia, Africa.
Middle East, like which countries?
I've been in Libya this past year. I've been in Syria. I've covered, you know, Iran, Iraq, and on to Afghanistan. It's conflict is something I've come to know, and so I'm interested in it, in trying to write about what happens to people in conflict. I'm not so interested in the people with the guns as I am the stories of the people in the society as it changes, and trying to figure out maybe the dynamics of that. Anyway, so that's kind of it.
أكيد كصحافي كمان غطى الكثير من الحروب بجنوب أمريكا، وعم بيقول قد ايه كان اهتمام الامريكان انه يعملوا حرب بجنوب امريكا وقتها باخر السبعينات، وكيف هلا ما بقى في ابدا اي اهتمام بهالموضوع، صار يهتمون من محل ثاني. واصلا كمان غطى حروب العراق، ايران وافغانستان، وما بيهتم هو اكثر بالناس اللي هي عم بتحارب، اكثر بيهتم اكثر بالمجتمع اللي عم بيعيش هالتغيرات. وايضا كنا عم نحكي انه قد ايه قلت له بلبنان ايضا بنشوف هالتغيرات من بعد الحرب. Now your interest is for the United States after 9/11, after what happens on the 11th of September in 2001. Why is it, and what are the main changes before and after the state?
You know, when this happened, I understood as an American. I've lived most of my life outside of America, but I am American. I've lived in many different countries, so I knew how the rest of the world would react. If I felt this was a very important time, I also knew how my countrymen would react. This event on 9/11 was somehow like the Pearl Harbor, and as we saw, there was a Pearl Harbor response.
Indeed.
Yes, And unfortunately, in my opinion, the United States was led by a man who was not equipped to be the president of the country. There was a lot of people who felt the same way. Nonetheless, my country went to war, and it went to war in a way that was overwhelming and without too much thought. I felt, as an American, that I had an obligation to be somewhere in the terrain explaining the people of those places. So my first reaction was to go to Afghanistan, where I had been before with the Mujahideen in the 80s, and to try to explain as well as I could the Afghans to Americans. Because remember,
you tried to be objective.
I tried to be. No one is truly objective. You
indeed.
try as a reporter. What I didn't want to happen was for my countrymen to think of Afghans as all the enemy. Because this happened in Vietnam. 50,000 Americans died in Vietnam, but over 2 million Vietnamese died. And I was very concerned that this kind of objectification not happen again. So this was one of my, I suppose, one of my motivations. And I felt that it was necessary to be there. This was a huge event that would change the world, and of course it did.
And I think as an American, you should, there's a lot to do for that, because actually we can see how all the background and all the framework changed with the vision of Arabs, and all Arabs were terrorists after 9/11.
Exactly, and then it became to Iraq, and this was a huge catastrophe.
Exactly, exactly. Mr. Shoulgin, our last question. What was your role in Hay Festival, especially as a Norwegian living in Turkey?
Well, my role in Hay Festival was not very big. It was actually not the Hay Festival first of all which brought me here, because Penn, we have worked together with Hay. We have the same office in London, the same place, and we have decided to work closely with Hay Festivals. But the real reason why I came to Lebanon this time was to prepare for a new Lebanese Penn Center.
It's beautiful.
To gain the real wonderful Lebanese writers, literature, which I think is so important for the whole region and for the whole world. As a matter of fact, of course, you have wonderful writers here, and we wanted to make an active Penn Center here. So that is why I'm here.
We do thank you. In the name of all Lebanese, and especially writers, I do thank you for that. عم بقول انه موجود بلبنان ليعمل ويأسس بان اوفيس لكل الكتاب اللبنانية والعرب. هذا شيء رائع جدا. John Lee Anderson, thank you for this interesting interview, and hope to see you soon in Lebanon.
Thank you.
With nice new books.
Thank you.
And Shoulgin, thank you very much, Mr. Shoulgin, and hope to see you soon in Lebanon too. And thank you for all your interest in Beirut.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. مشاهدينا الكرام، أنا بشوفكم بكرة بحلقة خاصة مع الدبلوماسي الفرنسي المتخصص بالأمور الجيوسياسية، وخاصة الماي مستر فرانك جالان، الساعة 11:30. وبتمنى لكم نهار ممتع. وهلأ بنبقى مع زميلتي نادية.